There is a moment in history when the most powerful weapon a nation possesses stops working. Not because it was defeated in battle, not because a superior military crushed it, but because the world quietly, methodically, and permanently decided to walk around it. That moment has already happened, and almost nobody is talking about it the way it deserves to be talked about. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is not speculation. It is a structural transformation already locked into place, one that has quietly redrawn the energy map of the entire Middle East and left one of the region's most feared powers standing in a room where all the doors have already been sealed shut. Welcome to Nexa World Brief. Stay with me until the final second of this video, because what unfolds here will change how you see every headline coming out of the Gulf for the rest of this decade. For more than 40 years, one idea governed global energy security above all others. A single ribbon of ocean water, barely wider than some city highways at its narrowest point, held the entire industrial world in a quiet but permanent state of anxiety. 21 million barrels of crude oil moved through that water every single day. Not occasionally, every day. The economies of China, Japan, South Korea, India, and much of Europe depended on that passage remaining open. Insurance premiums, shipping schedules, corporate supply chains, national energy reserves, all of it was calculated around one uncomfortable truth. If that water closed, the modern world would begin to fracture within weeks. And Iran knew this better than anyone. Tehran did not need aircraft carriers to project power. It did not need intercontinental missiles or a vast conventional military. All it needed was geography and the credibility to threaten it. The Strait of Hormuz became the most cost-efficient geopolitical weapon in modern history. Every time international pressure mounted, every time sanctions tightened, every time diplomatic tensions spiked, Iranian officials would remind the world what they controlled. Oil prices would surge. Tanker insurance would spike. Boardrooms from London to Tokyo would quietly panic. This was the architecture of asymmetric dominance. A small country using a geographic accident to punch so far above its weight that even the United States had to calculate its every regional move with Hormuz in mind. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary strategic achievement, and it lasted decades longer than it should have. But here is what the architects of that strategy failed to understand. Geography is a fixed asset. Infrastructure is not. And when a determined nation with vast capital, strong regional alliances, and a long-term strategic vision decides that a geographic weapon must be neutralized, not through war, not through sanctions, but through engineering, the results are not just effective. They are permanent. What Saudi Arabia has quietly constructed over recent years and what crystallized into a fully operational strategic bypass system in May 2026 is not simply an alternative shipping route. It is the methodical dismantling of Iran's entire geopolitical leverage framework, executed without a single bullet, without a single public confrontation, and with a speed and ambition that the international community is only beginning to fully comprehend. Think about what it means to render a weapon obsolete. You don't have to destroy it. You don't have to confront it. You simply have to make the world stop caring about it. When a threat loses its ability to create fear, it ceases to be a threat at all. That is precisely what is happening to the Strait of Hormuz right now. Not because it has become physically impassable, but because the nations that once trembled at its closure are rapidly, irreversibly building systems that make its closure strategically irrelevant. And the speed of this transition is the most alarming part, not just for Iran, but for every nation that assumed the old geography of power would hold. The scale of what Saudi Arabia has assembled deserves to be understood in full, because partial understanding leads to underestimating what is genuinely one of the most consequential infrastructure plays of the 21st century. Riyadh did not build one alternative. It built three simultaneously and designed each one to reinforce the others into something that functions less like a backup plan and more like a new global trade architecture. The first layer is a 9-port maritime network that has transformed Jeddah Islamic Port from a regional facility into a transcontinental logistics hub of staggering capacity. The second layer is a hybrid land and sea corridor spanning 1,300 kilometers, developed in partnership with MSC, the single largest container shipping company on the planet. The third layer is the East-West Petroline pipeline, a buried steel artery capable of moving 7 million barrels of crude oil per day across the Saudi peninsula, depositing it directly into the Red Sea, without ever approaching Iranian-controlled waters. Each of these systems was formidable individually. Together, they represent something that no analyst of Iranian strategic doctrine fully anticipated: a complete, redundant, high-capacity alternative to the Hormuz corridor, not a workaround, a replacement. And the distinction matters enormously because a workaround can be disrupted, pressured, made economically unattractive. A replacement changes the underlying logic of global trade. Once shipping companies sign long-term contracts routed through Jeddah, once tanker fleets are optimized for Red Sea transit, once the sunk costs of the new infrastructure make the old routes economically inefficient by comparison, reversing course becomes structurally impossible. That is the genius of what Riyadh has engineered. It has not just built an alternative, it has made the alternative the new default. The nine-port maritime network alone represents a kind of geopolitical audacity that rivals anything the region has seen in decades. Jeddah's transformation into a central redistribution hub connecting European ports, Southampton, Rotterdam, Hamburg, with major Asian industrial centers, including key Chinese and Japanese facilities, is not a minor logistical adjustment. It is a fundamental rewiring of global cargo flows. Consider what this means in practice. A container leaving a manufacturing facility in Asia bound for European markets no longer has to navigate the anxiety-inducing passage through Hormuz-adjacent waters. It can move through a Saudi-administered, security-guaranteed corridor with predictable transit times, modern automated handling infrastructure, and an institutional framework designed specifically to eliminate the risk premium that Iranian threats have historically injected into global shipping costs. For corporations managing global supply chains, this is not just convenient, it is transformative. Risk-adjusted logistics costs are a central input in competitive pricing. Any system that reliably reduces that risk premium becomes a competitive advantage, and companies that adopt it early lock in structural advantages over those that don't. Saudi Arabia has essentially weaponized reliability in a region that has been defined for decades by instability. What makes the human dimension of this shift so striking is the behavior of China. On paper, the relationship between Beijing and Tehran is one of the most strategically significant bilateral partnerships in the world. China purchases Iranian oil at heavily discounted prices. It provides diplomatic cover in international forums. It represents the primary economic lifeline, keeping Iran's sanctions-battered economy from total collapse. The relationship has been characterized by Western analysts as a foundational pillar of Iran's resistance strategy. Yet, when Saudi Arabia's new maritime network activated, connecting directly to major Chinese port facilities, Beijing did not hesitate. Chinese logistics operators began signing new routing agreements. Shipping volumes started shifting. The calculus was transparent and brutal. China's manufacturing economy requires uninterrupted access to Gulf energy. Any disruption to that access, whether caused by Iranian naval provocations, strait closures, or asymmetric military actions, inflicts damage on Chinese industry that no amount of discounted Iranian crude can compensate for. Economic survival, as it always does, outweighed political solidarity. Iran lost its most powerful economic patron not through any confrontation, but through the simple, devastating logic of superior infrastructure alternatives becoming available. Japan's integration into this network carries its own strategic weight. As a nation with virtually zero domestic energy production and some of the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chains in the world, Japan has always been acutely exposed to Hormuz risk. Tokyo's strategic petroleum reserves exist precisely because Japanese planners have always understood the catastrophic consequences of an extended Hormuz closure. The connection of Kobe, Nagoya, and Yokohama into the Jeddah-centered network is therefore not merely a commercial decision, it is a strategic declaration. Japan is voting with its cargo ships for a future in which the security of its energy imports is no longer contingent on Iranian restraint. That vote, coming from one of the world's most economically sophisticated nations, carries enormous signaling power. It tells every other country in the system that the new architecture is credible, durable, and worth committing to for the long term. Europe's participation completes a geopolitical picture that would have seemed almost implausible 5 years ago. Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Southampton are not peripheral ports. They are among the most important trade hubs on Earth, handling volumes that connect European industry to global supply chains at every level. Their formal integration into a maritime network designed explicitly to circumvent Hormuz-adjacent risks is as clear a statement as any diplomatic communique. European industry, already stressed by successive supply chain shocks in recent years, has made a structural decision to diversify away from vulnerable choke points. The Saudi network offers exactly the kind of institutional, infrastructure-backed alternative that corporate risk managers and national energy planners can present to boards and governments as a credible long-term solution. Contracts are being signed, routes are being locked in, the architecture is hardening. The 1,300-kilometer hybrid corridor developed with MSC deserves particular attention because it represents something genuinely unprecedented in the history of global logistics. The concept of a seamless sea-to-land-to-sea transit corridor operating at container shipping scale with satellite monitoring, dedicated highway infrastructure, and military security oversight integrated from the ground up is not just operationally ambitious. It is a new model for how physical trade infrastructure can be designed specifically to neutralize geographic vulnerabilities. Ships arriving from European waters unload at Saudi Red Sea ports with automated precision. Trucks built for heavy container loads move cargo across desert terrain on secure, monitored routes. Eastern coast ports receive the cargo and distribute it across the upper Gulf without a single nautical mile of the journey passing through waters that Iran can threaten. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has spent decades rehearsing strait disruption scenarios, now watches commercial volumes bypass them entirely. Their exercises are becoming theater performed for an audience that has already left the building. Beneath all of this, the Petroline pipeline operates as the energy backbone of the entire bypass system. 7 million barrels per day is a number that requires context to fully grasp. It represents not just a significant fraction of global oil trade, but a volume large enough that its availability as a Hormuz alternative fundamentally changes the risk calculations of every major energy importer in the world. When this pipeline demonstrated full operational capacity during the 2026 period of regional tension, it was not simply a technical proof of concept. It was a message to global energy markets. The insurance policy is real, it is tested, and it works. Protected by layered air and missile defense infrastructure, operating underground across terrain that is difficult to access and monitor, the Petroline represents the kind of hardened, resilient energy infrastructure that transforms geopolitical equations at their root. You cannot threaten what you cannot reach, and Iran cannot reach what Saudi Arabia has buried, guarded, and integrated into the global energy system as a permanent feature. The regional ripple effects extend far beyond Saudi Arabia's own construction. The UAE's expanded pipeline connecting its interior oil fields directly to the Gulf of Oman's open waters gives Abu Dhabi full energy export independence from Hormuz, a capability it has invested billions to develop and is now actively utilizing. Iraq's $24 billion development road project, linking the Grand Fa port in Basra through rail and highway infrastructure all the way to Turkey and onward into European networks, represents a generational commitment to a future in which Hormuz is a secondary consideration rather than the defining constraint on Gulf connectivity. Even the smaller Gulf states, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, historically trapped by geography into dependency on Hormuz, are integrating into alternative networks with a speed that reflects genuine strategic urgency rather than leisurely long-term planning. The collective message from these parallel investments is unmistakable. The Gulf's most powerful economies have made a collective decision that their futures will not be held hostage by a single waterway. That decision is not reversible, it is structural. What sits at the heart of this transformation is a principle that military strategists are only beginning to fully absorb. In the 21st century, infrastructure has become more powerful than military force as a tool of strategic competition. Iran built its regional dominance on the threat of denial, the ability to deny others access to a resource they needed. Saudi Arabia has responded not by building a bigger military capable of protecting that access, but by building systems that eliminate the need for the access Iran was threatening to deny. This is a fundamentally different kind of strategic competition. It does not make headlines the way missile strikes do. It does not generate the dramatic imagery of naval confrontations, but its consequences are more durable, more comprehensive, and ultimately more decisive than any military engagement could produce. A battle can be won or lost. Infrastructure, once built and integrated into global commercial systems, simply becomes the new reality. And yet the situation remains deeply unstable in ways that should not be dismissed. Iran has not accepted its diminished position quietly or graciously. A nation that has defined its regional identity around strategic resistance does not simply acknowledge defeat and redirect its energies. The pressure on Iranian leadership to demonstrate continued relevance, to prove to domestic audiences and regional allies that the old leverage has not evaporated, creates dynamics that are genuinely dangerous. Desperation and strategic irrelevance are a volatile combination. The very fact that the new bypass corridors represent such a comprehensive threat to Iranian influence creates powerful incentives to disrupt them, not because disruption would restore Iran's leverage, but because the alternative is acknowledging that the leverage is gone. Whether that desperation translates into direct action against Saudi infrastructure, accelerated nuclear developments as an alternative deterrent, or proxy escalation through regional partners, the next phase of this confrontation will not be calm. The silence war of systems and logistics is not concluded. It has entered a new and more unpredictable chapter. The deeper question lurking beneath all of this is one that no map and no pipeline can answer. When a nation loses the strategic asset that defined its regional power for 4 decades, what does it become? Iran is not a small country. It is not a weak state. It has a sophisticated population, significant conventional military capabilities, and deep historical roots in regional politics. But it is a state whose primary tool of geopolitical leverage has been systematically dismantled by neighbors who chose engineering over confrontation. The world is watching to see how that state responds, and whether the response accelerates the very isolation it was designed to resist. The new energy map of the Middle East is drawn, the corridors are operating, the contracts are signed, but the human and political consequences of what this map represents have barely begun to unfold. What happens when a nation reaches for its most powerful weapon and finds that the world has simply stopped caring whether it uses it or not? That question does not yet have an answer, but the answer is coming. And when it arrives, it will reshape everything we think we understand about power, geography, and the silent forces that actually govern the modern world.